It's block party time in our first live show of the 2024 season. We got the week 2 main slate on tap, Jmtowin from 1 week season. As always, here to walk us through the slate, go through the top plays at each of the positions, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And then we'll wrap up by building a lineup on DraftKings with one of JM's favorite building blocks for this slate. I'm Pete Overzet. This is the block party. Let's do it.
Peter's one of the greatest depositors I've ever seen.
Trust the process. Let's go.
I got auto match with Levitan. Bullshit.
I just go the other way. In that 66, I win all the money. All the money.
If I had 150 lineups, I'd win too.
AP, 35 bullets in your head like KD. Bust it, bitch, go bust it. And I had 10 pints with me in Russia.
Hey, everyone.
All right, JM, we were pre-recorded last week. We are live this week, 1 p.m. Eastern as we record this. How did your week 1 go? All of that good stuff.
Week 1 was basically break even, which kind of always take that, right? Ideally, you're kind of breaking even up a little bit when you're down a little bit, and then have those 2-3 spiked weeks throughout the season. So kind of weird after the fact that I was break even because my top quarterbacks were Anthony Richardson and Jaden Daniels and Josh Allen, and some of my top running backs. My highest owned running back was Joe Mixon, had tons of J.K. Dobbins. Wow. And there were only, this is wild, right? There were only 12 skill position players who topped 20 DraftKings points last week. And all of them were, 2 or 3 of those wide receivers were Tyreek Hill, and Diggs and Nico were heavily mixed throughout my rosters. And so just one of those weeks where kind of in the moment of the day, it was like, oh yeah, it was like a decent week. I probably could have been sharper. And then after the fact, it was like, oh, like I actually had literally everything that hit. And like, it's one of those things where the rosters could have come together in the Bink machine in a different way to where it's just like, I had a great week, lots of Vikings defense, lots of Bears defense. But yeah, just rosters didn't come together in the right way. So one of those weeks, I feel like we learned a lot. And yeah, it gives us it kind of feels like week 1, doesn't it? Because for you and me as like content providers, it's the first time on the real schedule where it's like everything's condensed into 1 week and live show today. So yeah, I feel like we learned a lot in week 1. We'll learn a lot more over the next few weeks about these teams because they'll be learning a lot about themselves. But yeah, what about you? How was week 1?
A bit of a mixed bag as well. I didn't cash. I played smaller volume than I will as we kind of go forward, just because with all the chaos and I didn't feel like I was as dialed in. I do got to give a shout out. The full block didn't hit, but Ladd McConkey ended up being one of those, better, rookie gems on the slate. So as you kind of prefaced, you were like, maybe some of this works this week, maybe it doesn't hit fully, but eventually it will hit. And the Chargers are looking kind of like a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, this will be, I think, one of those, when we think about how teams try to win games, I think this will be another one of those weeks where, I've been saying that I think Herbert's average pass attempts per game will land in this 33 to 35 range. He'll have some of these 28 attempt games, some of these 40 attempt games. Last week was 26 attempts. I think this is another week that's going to drag down that average a little bit, but we'll see some of these weeks where he's throwing the ball 40 times and we know where the ball's going to go for sure.
What about, one of the things that's so fun after having week 1, and I know you don't spend a ton of time on Twitter, but the overreactions have been wild this week. That always happens, but I feel like the intensity of the overreactions is even bigger. There's kind of this element of you don't want to underreact either, though, because some things are much different than we thought. Were there any things that jump out to you from week 1 that surprised you, whether that's in the macro or a team or something you want to kind of get out ahead of?
Yeah, I don't know that anything major stands out because I think that a lot of it is game specific or like we see Jonnu Smith, right? I really like Jonnu Smith as a cheap way to save salary last week. And then he comes out and gets 2 targets, but then he comes out this week on Thursday night and he gets 7 targets. A lot of that was schemed looks, right? Where they're just trying to get him the ball in space on underneath throws. And so there's a lot that's like week to week and dependent on that. And because I spend so little time in the Twitter sphere, there are certain pieces that I was coming across this week and just thinking, oh man, people are going to really overreact. Off the top of my head, I can't think what it is, what some of them were, but it's like, just most of the time, most players are going to have like 3 really good price considered games all season. And there's going to be a lot of guys who had that good price considered game in week 1, and people are just going to assume that that's going to happen again the next week. And it almost certainly won't. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot that we can take away from week 1, but also a lot that's still unknown. I think maybe the biggest thing, and this isn't even directly to like the DFS and fantasy overreaction space, but like really sharp people who are on the outside breaking down all the teams and players and games. There was a lot of talk about, oh man, maybe the Saints are a lot better than we thought, and this offensive line that we thought was going to be a real problem for them, maybe they're really good. Like my write-up for that game last week talked about how bad the Saints offensive line is, and how important it is for Derek Carr to have a good offensive line. And yet, because of the Panthers pass rush that they were facing last week, I said this could be one of the rare clean Derek Carr games that we have this season, which could really give him an opportunity to have a big game. And now he's playing the Cowboys this week, and that pass rush, and people are kind of like, oh, maybe this spot, maybe the Cardinals being favored at home against the Rams because they jumped out to that early lead against the Bills. The Rams took this Super Bowl contender and the Lions down to the wire. Obviously, the game's in Arizona, so that helps the Cardinals a little bit. But yeah, there's just some overreactions like that, even on like the macro NFL landscape, because people get so dialed in on like what just happened that it's hard for them to see the big picture of, if we could look at week 8 and then kind of look back over the first 7 weeks of the season, our reactions to these week 1 results will be a little bit different.
Yeah, and that happens every year. There's always the funny ones from week 1. I remember Sammy Watkins having a massive game from the Jags turning into pumpkin. I remember a real old school one. Remember when Jared Cook went off for like 25 points in week 1? I remember being in season-long leagues where people were sending out Godfather offers. I don't think he topped like 8 points the rest of the year. So that's a tale as old as time.
Clyde Edwards-Helaire it took like 4 years for people to shake the thought there that Clyde Edwards-Helaire was like this top running back in the NFL with the top, fantasy production range of outcomes. And first career game is like 32 DraftKings points. I don't think he got close to that ever since.
It is funny, right? There's you get the double psychological effect of like, one, obviously recency bias, what just happened, but I don't know what a psychologist can tell me if it's like the primary bias too, where it's like that first impression too is so hard to shake, where it's like hard for us to come around on guys who flop. And it's so easy for us to be like, no, this is going to continue happening over and over again.
Yeah, and it's critical to think about those things because, and we talk about stuff like that a lot in Inner Circle, but even in the Angles podcast. When I'm talking about players, I'll often touch on the way that the DFS community perceives that player. So kind of the reverse of that is like if a player starts a season slowly and then they start putting up these, like let's say Alan Lazard had started the season with 4 points and 6 points and 3 points and 7 points. And then in week 5, he goes and puts up 26 points. Everybody's going to perceive that as a fluke, right? But there's also really good players who kind of have a couple slow weeks early in the season, and then their big game gets kind of buried because they're low owned and people aren't on them. Or even Josh Allen in his rookie year. I mean, we made tremendous amounts of money weeks 14, 13 through 18 that year. I guess there were 17 weeks back then. Just saying play Josh Allen every single week. But nobody, he had a rough start to his career. And all the talk around him was negative heading into the NFL. He doesn't have accuracy. He's not ready for the NFL. He was hurt for a few weeks and came back. Nobody watched Bills games back then. They weren't on TV. And it was like, oh, Josh Allen put up a big game. That's a fluke. And it kept happening, but people weren't able to adjust their perception on it. And so the reverse kind of happens when a guy has a big game early is people just keep waiting for that to happen again. So kind of building our understanding and assessments of these players as the season moves along is valuable because we can avoid that rut. And then also realizing that these players and these teams and these situations are developing constantly. All of these NFL teams are in a constant state of flux. You hear Belichick talk about you use September, you use those first 4 games of the season to really understand your strengths and weaknesses as a team. Like that's extended preseason, basically. You got to win those games because they count in the standings, but really that's extended preseason. You're coming to understand your team. And then October, you're starting to sharpen things. And, he always said the NFL season doesn't start till after Thanksgiving. And what he means by that is by then you should know who you are as a team, who you can rely on, how you're using these players, what your strengths and weaknesses are. And hopefully you're playing your best football by that point down the stretch run. So if we can think that way as DFS players, then we can constantly adjust. I mean, I saw a blurb this week about looks like we're waiting on Marvin Harrison being a focal point of the offense. And it's like, well, the Bills double covered him all game. And it was from Kyler Murray saying, it's not my job to get Marvin Harrison the ball. Yeah. It's my job to go through the reads. And it's like literally that's any quarterback in the NFL. It's their job to go through the reads. If a guy has, if he has outside leverage and he's on an outbreaking route, he can be covered and you're still going to throw it to him. That'll happen for Marvin Harrison. But if a guy's double covered, you're not going to throw him the ball. That means other guys are open. And so Actually, Marvin Harrison is a really interesting play this week in a game that everybody likes, and his ownership is coming in at like sub 2% early in the week. And so, there's some fun spots like that where we don't need to completely adjust our expectations on individual players or teams just because of what happened in week one. We can learn a lot, but there's also still a lot more information gathering that we can do and kind of stay in that middle ground and definitely gain an edge in that way.
All right, this is going to be the outline for the show. You guys know the drill. We are going to overview the week 2 DFS slate kind of from a high level here, what the games are looking like. Then we'll go position by position, and then we'll build that DraftKings lineup. I do want to mention last week we had 1 week season was open for business. Anyone could go check it out for free. It is now behind the paywall as it should be, but you can get 20% off with promo code Pete. You can take advantage of that. Go poke around. Hopefully you guys got to see kind of the offerings last week and are excited about the content offerings that will populate over the next day or two as we get in advance of the slate. But JM, I do pull up the matchups here. I believe only 4 teams with a total over 25 this week. We got 10 of the early games. Again, the lopsided nature that we tend to get with the NFL. What kind of stood out to you as far as this slate on the whole?
It's a really interesting slate. Part of it is who's missing from the slate. And so you're missing Jalen Hurts, you're missing Josh Allen, you're missing Tyreek Hill, you're missing the Texans wideouts, you're missing Joe Mixon, you're missing the Bears who, people are excited about playing those guys. And so even with no buys and no double Monday night game, no Friday night game, it still kind of feels like a thin slate. And then that's not just the nature of who's missing from the slate, but it's just like the matchups on the slate. We don't have a lot of games. So I talked about this in Winner's Circle this last week, and I went in depth on it. This is one of the most obvious things anyone could ever say about the game of football, and yet nobody thinks of the game of football this way. And that's that, especially at the NFL level, football is all about getting first downs, right? Like that's all that an offensive coordinator is focused on. And if you watch 20 years of Brady or Manning, you watch all of Mahomes' career, like you understand that really what makes those guys so good is that they're always able to pick up first down. So first down then is about getting into second and advantageous. Second down is about trying to get that first down or get yourself into third and advantageous. And then if you have third and short, you're going to pick that up most of the time and you just keep driving the field. And so that's really what determines game environment. It's not who can hit big plays, because that's going to be 3, 4, 5 times a game that most teams are going to try that. It's about, can you kind of move the ball on this defense? And if you're able to move the ball, then ideally you score in the red zone. And you just kind of have a lot of spots this week where one or both teams in the game are going to have a hard time moving the ball or project to have a hard time moving the ball. And so then you don't have a lot of opportunities for shootouts to develop. So you look at that Chargers game last week as an example where you take control in this game, or even the Bills game last night, Josh Allen throwing the ball 19 times. You take control of the game, and it transforms the rest of the game because you're not going into a shell and not trying to pick up first downs, but your aggressiveness in how you go about trying to get those first downs changes, and your tendency to attack downfield changes. And so it becomes more about, all right, let's just keep marching the field, pick up these first downs. The longer this takes, the better it is for us once you're in control of the game for most of these teams. And so, it's just an interesting week where we have a lot of game environments that it doesn't look like there's a game environment that is really going to separate from everything else. Obviously, Lions and Bucks is one of the more attractive ones. Rams and Cardinals is one of the more attractive ones. But like true shootout type stuff, and you got to think about the price tags in these games as well, and how spread out these offenses are, how concentrated they are. It's a week where like my list, after I built out my player pool, I had to go through it like 4 or 5 extra times just to be like, I must be missing something, because my quarterbacks, there's nobody on my quarterback list. And I'm like, okay, I want 40% of this guy. And then the rest is spread out behind that. My running back list, I have one guy, but then it was like the rest of the list was kind of like, wait, how do I fill out the rest of this? It's a pretty small list, but there's nobody on here I'm super confident in. So then I kind of looked through all the other guys and it's like, well, nobody really usurps the guys I have. And so it's just one of those weeks where I don't think there's a ton to love. And so kind of figuring out the tiers of where players land on the slate is valuable. And then you can kind of mix and match them from there.
Yeah, it is interesting too. And when I look at the teams, and looking at some of the salaries, I would say like 2 of the big changes post week 1, Puka Nacua not being on the Rams offense has had a pretty big trickle down, obviously, into usage, but also salaries. And we'll hit on some of those as we move along. And then the other kind of really big shift from week one is the Packers are now without Jordan Love. Like Jordan Love on this Packers team, we're probably all circling this Packers Colts game as one of the best games of the week. Like, how are you? Are the Packers just like fully off the menu for as long as Malik Willis is the quarterback?
I don't think that you necessarily have to have that outlook in large field play because we've seen enough Malik Willis that nobody wants to roster him. And like I was looking through early ownership projections last night, and Jaden Reed is sub 2%, and I think Malik Willis is sub 2%. And so the ownership is low enough on those guys that you could justify taking some swings in large field play. But we've also seen enough Malik Willis that's like, I mean, the dude couldn't get off a Hail Mary pass, and it looked like he wasn't going to. Like from the moment he got the snap, it was like, oh my gosh, Malik Willis is going to take a sack here, isn't he? And that's the thing. Like, what do you get? He has like 52 pass attempts in his career and like 15 sacks taken, something crazy like that. It's like this guy just has no feel for the pocket in the NFL, no awareness of the NFL game. And so if there's one guy I would trust to coach him through that, it would be Shane Steichen. But if there's a second guy I would trust to coach him through that, it would be Matt LaFleur. And what's great about Steichen and LaFleur, we talk about the NFL game being about picking up first downs, is both of these guys are able to take the quarterback talent that they have and call the game according to that, to just try to keep marching the field. So I could see the Packers figuring out a way to stay competitive in this game. And the Vegas line in this game kind of implies that, but it also implies like, okay, neither team is going to be super aggressive, because if you're the Colts, now you can say, obviously they're going to take their shots downfield, but you're also going to say, look, let's control this game. We can probably do that. And if you're the Packers, you're going to say, let's do everything we can to not let Malik Willis lose this one for us. So I don't have any Packers on my list, but I think in large field play, you can take a shot. And the thing for me, we're early enough in the season. Amari Cooper is coming at sub 3% projected ownership, right? And when I say that name, the reaction immediately from most people is like, well, of course, I don't want to play Amari Cooper. In 3 of his last 8 games with Deshaun Watson, 3 of his last 8 games with Watson, he's put up 27.6 or more DraftKings points. 3 of his last 8 games, that's a pretty high rate, and he's going to be sub 3% owned. He had 9 targets last week. David Njoku is going to be out, right? So my point is there's still players like that, sub 3% that you can go to, where it's like, oh, this guy really should be like 8 or 9% owned, and I'm getting him at 3%, as opposed to the Packers, who it's like they probably should be 2 or 3% owned, and they're 2 or 3% owned. So I wouldn't argue against them in large field play, but they're hands off for me in smaller field stuff, and they're not on my list this week.
All right, let's head over to quarterbacks. Then we won't, I promise, spend too much time on Malik Willis. We can get to the good stuff here. I would say kind of one of the big just macro themes from last week was all of the rushing quarterbacks really kind of getting there on their own. Josh Allen, massive score, 2 rushing TDs. Jaden Daniels, massive score, 2 rushing TDs. Anthony Richardson had a rushing TD and a massive score. I see those guys being very popular. Again, obviously Allen not on the slate, but Daniels, Richardson, Lamar though can kind of be our proxy for Josh Allen this week. What are you seeing kind of at the high end and overall with the quarterbacks?
Yeah, Lamar's not on my list, so I'll start there. And I actually don't have the notes on it, but in the NFL Edge, I broke down just like the type of game environment that Lamar typically needs in order to put up the type of score that you want. I think it's like it was something like, well, I won't even try to quote the numbers because I don't have them in my mind. I put them out of my mind as soon as I researched them and put them in my DFS interpretation for that game. So if you want to find them, you can find them there. But just like Lamar is typically dependent on game environment to post a tournament winning score. And so if we don't think that the Raiders can keep pace in this spot, then that means we don't think that Lamar can put up 30 plus points. Does he put up like 20, 24, 25? Very easily could, right? But I don't want to spend that salary for that type of score. And then I do have a little bit of concerns about this Ravens offensive line against this Raiders defensive front. So Lamar's not on my list. I kind of like that he's going to be one of the higher owned quarterbacks on the slate, or at least it looks like that right now, because when I can find those spots where it's like, I don't have interest on this guy based on the research. And that's not to say he won't hit. It's just to say that if we played out this slate 100 times, I would expect him to hit less often considering his salary than most of the other ways you could spend salary. So I kind of like spots like that. And again, I always want to think about game environments because a lot of times that's what drives the scoring. And so, I kind of also think about, it looks like Anthony Richardson's not drawing that much attention because his price jumped so much. And so I think that that's going to push some people off him, but still a guy who we know that he can put up 30 points anytime he's on the field. And then you got Jaden Daniels also on the other side of that game, Daniel Jones, where it's always scary to go to Daniel Jones, but you also know there's that 30-point upside at a really cheap price tag. And then Kyler Murray, who's a running quarterback that, he didn't hit in the running department last week, and he really hasn't done that too frequently of late. In fact, it was 5 for 57 yards, right? And so it was like still a really nice game, but he doesn't get that touchdown that the other guys have. And so a guy who maybe doesn't draw as much attention as he would have if he'd imagine Kyler put up 25 points last week, right? Like the attention on him and ownership on him would be much higher. And he very easily could have put up that type of score. So that's kind of where I'm looking. And then some other quarterbacks, Matthew Stafford in that game with Kyler, I think is in the mix. Brock Purdy, I think is very much in the mix this week at his price tag because he's pretty consistently, he averaged over 20 DraftKings points a year, over 20 DraftKings points a game last year. And so in this spot against Minnesota, a defense that we could get into that, but really gave them fits last year. And there's a lot of reasons why, but that doesn't guarantee that that's going to be the case again this year. And so, for me, it's kind of like the running quarterbacks, Kyler and Stafford in that game, then Jaden and Daniel Jones in their game. Anthony Richardson, some interest in Justin Fields and Brock Purdy is kind of where I'm looking at quarterback this week.
On the note with the rushing quarterbacks, because the way things played out last week was you really didn't need the stacking partners with them unless you were smart enough to get to, say, Alec Pierce, but definitely not necessarily with the Bills or Jaden Daniels, who kind of just did it all on their own. One of the things I've been thinking in my head is we might see an overreaction to that, as if yes, these guys that you can play just solo naked, that they will always get there in that way, and kind of wondering, do you see some opportunities to potentially stack these guys up because it might be underutilized this week? Yeah,
it's funny. That's part of the reason, right? When I look back at how did they have all these rosters that had so many things right and didn't hit? It was because all of my Jaden Daniels had Terry McLaurin. All of my Anthony Richardson had A.D. Mitchell, which, he was inexpensive enough that doesn't kill you. But when you're watching the game and A.D. Mitchell's wide open 2 different times downfield and Anthony Richardson misses him. I think one of them, A.D. Mitchell ran the wrong route, but was wide open. The other one is just a misfire by Anthony Richardson. It kind of pulls at you a little bit like, oh man, if those had hit, then everything kind of shifts in the way that this plays out for me. I think that if you look at the overall sample of running quarterbacks, it's extremely rare for one of them to hit and not bring anybody with them. So what I always say is, even on the guys who it's hard to know which guy will hit with them, well, you still have to think about the tournament you're playing in and the fact that, yes, I have to guess among 3 different guys, right? And that's not ideal. But somebody in the tournament I'm playing in will guess correctly among the 3 guys who could hit with this quarterback. And if they guess correctly, then I'm chasing them for points, right? So I need to put myself in a position where I'm that person who potentially guessed correctly and other people are chasing me. And so most of the time with running quarterbacks, it's very rare that they don't bring at least one pass catcher with them. And so it's really unique that last week, obviously, Anthony Richardson did bring Alec Pierce with him. But no, I was flipping through the leaderboards in the slant, and it was I had to go to 22nd place or something before I found an Alec Pierce roster. People just didn't have him. And so then Jaden Daniels really just kind of a unique situation. I have enough questions about how Cliff Kingsbury runs his offense that it's do we need a wide receiver, right? Is anybody going to pile up 100 yards when Cliff Kingsbury's throwing everything 5 to 7 yards down the field? But no, I do think that by and large, the rule of thumb should be still pair your running quarterback with a pass catcher. And the fact that most people will probably overreact makes it even more plus EV to do that. Because again, Jaden Daniels isn't going to rush for 34 touchdowns on the season. Most weeks he's not going to get that rushing touchdown. And so really what you're saying is he picks up some yards and also has a good game through the air. Hopefully gets 1 rushing touchdown is really what you're saying when you get these guys. So I don't know that I mind a little bit of Jaden Daniels without a pass catcher, but generally speaking, my plan is just pair these guys with a pass catcher.
Yeah, that's the way I'm certainly leaning as well. And also, obviously, we don't cover underdog strategy on this show. We're going to do that at right after at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. I do often on the clock, but there's this dynamic playing out, JM, in those drafts where, Richardson, Daniels get taken in every single one, but Pittman and McLaurin are never getting drafted. like ever. So even just stacking those guys up in that format, I think is a nice little edge this week. I do want to ask about the guy who probably projects best on the slate, just raw points at quarterback, being Patrick Mahomes at 7,000. Is he a guy you would give a look to? Should also mention, we just got the news today that Hollywood Brown is not going to be back anytime soon. It sounds like he might miss the entire regular season, but any thoughts on Mahomes?
Yeah, I always think about a quarterback, not just in terms of what you spend on that quarterback, but in terms of what you spend for the full block, the quarterback and the pass catcher that you're pairing him with, and then how much certainty there is on that block. So the pricing on Rashee Rice, on Xavier Worthy, on Isaiah Pacheco, to a lesser extent Travis Kelce, although I think it's like the last time Travis Kelce topped 16 DraftKings points in a regular season game was last October. Like the total price tag you're having to spend, to me, doesn't make it all that attractive, because this, even with Rashee Rice, consistently getting 8 or more targets. I think it's like 3 games that he has, or 4 games that he has with double-digit targets in the regular season. Like he's typically going to get 8+ targets, but it's not like he's getting the 12, 14 target spiked week that can really help you get those 35-point games. And so, when I kind of put together the total salary spent and the certainty that comes with it, it's not something that I love, and I avoided it. Obviously last year was a unique year, but I don't think I played Mahomes all year last year, and it didn't hurt me. And I think the year before I primarily avoided him. It's just one of these teams where it's like, it always looks good because the team total looks good, but it doesn't typically produce tournament winning DFS combination scores. So, in large field play, I'm going to have some in large field play. I want to have some full on stacks of that game, because I see that being a game that like we could look up and it's 37-31. I don't think that will happen, but it's certainly within the realm of reasonable possibilities. So for me, like tighter builds, and that's kind of what my quote list is that we go through, is like, these are guys that I'm probably mixing and matching on single entry 3 max. Right now, that game is not on my list, but I also have that game set aside as like, I want to have a block of my large field rosters that are built around a story of this game shooting out, right? I wouldn't want Mahomes and Rashee Rice and no bring back. I want to tell a story of the Bengals keep this game close. The Bengals are scoring points. And then you run into a situation where it's like, oh, this could be an actual shootout. Probably not likely with the Bengals missing T. Higgins, with how good the Chiefs defense has been over the last couple of years, but it can happen, right? And then you get all the points and really tell the story of how that game takes off.
I guess the only other quarterbacks we mentioned, a lot of the high-end guys, the rushing quarterbacks. You did mention Daniel Dimes as a place to potentially go if you want to save money there. I guess maybe 2 others to hit on would be some of these pocket passers. Baker Mayfield, almost broke the slate last week, salary adjusted. You got him at 5,900 again in a nice game environment versus Detroit. You also have Sam Darnold, who's down at 5,200, maybe a little catch-up mode there against the Niners. Any of these more pocket passers catching your eye that are cheaper?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about Goff, a lot of time thinking about Baker, a lot of time thinking about Dak, and a lot of time thinking about Sam Darnold. So Sam Darnold was probably the last one that I like officially cut off my list for tighter builds, but I wouldn't be averse to putting him on there. I mean, he was kind of the talk of film watchers this last week. He looked so good this last week. Obviously a really soft matchup against that Giants secondary, but there's a reason why Kyle Shanahan wanted Sam Darnold as his backup last year. Kyle Shanahan, who's dealt with a lot of quarterback injuries and knows how important it is to have a backup who can step in there and keep the offense on track. There's a reason why Kevin O'Connell wanted Sam Darnold, and Sam Darnold looked really good in that first game. So yeah, I am not averse to Sam Darnold. He's kind of off my list because you got to cut some guys off your tighter pool. I'm not averse to Dak in this game against the Saints. I think that this is a game that the Cowboys defense should dominate. And so then, the Cowboys offense, a lot of times they win last year they had 7 games of 38 or more points scored, which is just mind blowing. But also like eventually you get to that point where Dak's not necessarily benefiting fully from all those points. And so, there's a lot of like my list. I don't feel like full transparency. I don't feel great about my quarterback list. It's not like, oh, these are clearly the guys. It's like, these are the guys that I'm going to settle on because there's this pool of guys who are all kind of evenly matched. Baker, he was so consistent last year, like consistently 17 to 20 points. And then people wouldn't roster him because it's like, well, he doesn't get those 30 pointers. And it's like, well, yeah, but you don't understand. Like all it takes is one game with the 300-yard bonus or one game with that extra touchdown or two going into the end zone. And then he does get that scored kind of down the stretch. Last year, he had a couple of those, then started the season with that. But it's like most of the time he's going to get in that 17 to 20 point range. And then every once in a while, he'll have one of these bigger ones. So I don't see last week being indicative of what we're going to see from Baker moving forward. I think it's just a continuation of what we had last year. This was one of the up weeks, and then the down weeks are still going to be solid. So yeah, I mean, I have no arguments against Baker, Goff, Dak, Darnold. Some arguments against Darnold, but he's cheap too, right? But it's just kind of like I had to take this pool of quarterbacks that nothing really stood out from anything else and narrow it down to like a tighter group.
Let's move over to running back now. I think, the biggest kind of, domino on this slate is obviously what's going on with Christian McCaffrey. Obviously, a very surprise late scratch last week. Schefter immediately comes out and says, and it sounds like he'll miss this week. Then all of a sudden he's at practice, limited fashion. You can't tell, are the Niners just trying to save face here and not get fined because Jordan Mason heard he was going to start last Friday? Most people have already heard this saga by now, but let's start with running back. Feel free to hit on the CMC Jordan Mason situation and the other things that are jumping out to you at running back.
Yeah, so I have kind of two tiers at running back, and the second tier has four guys in it, and you could really you could take out my four guys and put in a different four guys, but the top four to me are clearly the top four running backs on the slate. So Jordan Mason is in that group. Assuming I'm just right now treating this as if Christian McCaffrey won't play, and Jordan Mason is not gonna scoop up the pass game usage that Christian McCaffrey is going to scoop up, right? If Christian McCaffrey plays, I'll say like the main thing you need to have an understanding of heading into Sunday is he expected to have his normal role, or is he going to be just kind of in and out? If he's expected to have his normal role, then Christian McCaffrey is a top play, right? Regardless of salary. If he's out, Jordan Mason's not going to have the full Christian McCaffrey role, which actually makes Deebo Samueel like that much more interesting at the wide receiver position because he has to take on some of that McCaffrey stuff. But also Jordan Mason's probably getting 20 plus carries on a really good team, probably getting 22 plus touches on a really good team. So similar to the way that like Elijah Mitchell is going to have a broader range of outcomes than Christian McCaffrey, but still a really nice play at these cheap price tags. So if this had all happened before pricing came out and they bumped Mason up to 6,200 or something, I wouldn't be as confident putting him kind of on my tighter, at this top tier of my tighter pool, but he's going to get the usage and going to be part of this offensive scoring point. So I think that's a spot where you don't have to overthink it too much. The other three guys kind of in this tier for me are Breece Hall, James Conner, and Kyren Williams. And we're basically just talking, workload, targets, carries, touchdown opportunities, on teams that have an opportunity to score quite a few points. And so that's kind of my top four right there is Kyren, James Conner, Breece Hall, and Jordan Mason.
Yeah. And kind of looking at early ownership stuff, it seems like Breece is going to be popular. Kyren, Mason. Doesn't seem like James Conner is going to maybe be quite as popular as some other plays. You want to talk about him a little bit? Obviously had an awesome workload last week. What do you like about the spot for him this week?
I mean, it's consistent. It's every single week. He's always getting, 17 plus DraftKings points with the occasional 24, 25, 26. And people don't play him because he's not sexy. He can't hit for these breakaway runs, but the Cardinals love him. They're going to use him in the passing game. They're going to use him on the ground. They're going to use him close to the end zone. So just the floor ceiling, I'm really looking at running back as more about the floor and consistency than about like our ability to pinpoint ceiling. Because if you go back through the running back position last year and compare it to the wide receiver position, compare it by price tag, the number of spiked weeks that we're getting that say a 6K running back versus a 6K wide receiver is so much lower. 7K running back versus 7K wide receiver. Like it's just very clearly better to spend that 7K at wide receiver than at running back. The problem at running back is it's not like 2014 where Adrian Peterson was 8K and then you've got all these pass catching running backs who are 5K and are going to get 15 to 20 points, right? It's like the cheaper guys are really not worth going to. You have to roster two running backs. You're forced to roster two running backs. You don't want to just take a dud at the running back position in order to save salary, but you also don't want to overspend on, a lot of these guys who are priced, Jonathan Taylor had, I think it was 16 touches last week. Travis Etienne had 16 touches. Like a lot of these higher priced guys aren't seeing significantly more touches than some of these cheaper guys. Or Jonathan Taylor, really doesn't catch that many passes, is going to remain the case with Anthony Richardson. And so finding those guys who are going to consistently score points. And if they're consistently scoring points, I saw a lot of people last week saying, Rachaad White only put up one elite game last year, only 2 games north of 24 points. And it's like, yeah. And all the other running backs that people liked put up 3 games north of 24 points last year. It's like, and that's just the difference of variance of like one game where Rachaad White got stopped at the 1. If he doesn't and he scores that touchdown, then he has 3 games north of 24 points. So it's like these guys who are consistently their role gets them consistently in this 15, 16, 17 point range. That's good enough for me, right? Because over time, they're going to hit as many 24 to 28 point games as the next guy. And it's really hard to know when it's going to happen. And so I want to make sure that the running back position doesn't wreck my roster, that it has that high floor opportunity. And then also, if we can get some ceiling from there, all the better.
Let's talk about Rachaad White. Maybe we could talk about the running backs in that Detroit and Tampa Bay game, projected for the most points. So certainly a game environment we're interested in. It does seem like Rachaad White is going to maybe fly under the radar, which is kind of interesting considering he had 6 targets, 75 yards, 15 rush attempts. Bucky Irving did look really good on the ground. It seems like people are almost like anticipating the rug pull on Rachaad White's rushing usage. And now it's like a 50-50 split with Bucky Irving. Any thoughts on Rachaad White and then the Lions backfield as well?
Yeah, well, we did what we were paying for last year from Rachaad White was the fact that he's going to get those consistent touches. And Bucky Irving took 9 carries, 2 targets or 3 targets, right? That's a lot of opportunity that he took away from Rachaad White. So we had a week where there was enough available opportunity for there to be, 12 available opportunities for Bucky Irving, 21 for Rachaad White. That's 33 running back opportunities. Not every week is going to have that many available running back opportunities. So if you run into a week where you have 25 available running back opportunities and Bucky Irving is getting some of these carved out for him, then Rachaad White has to rely more on efficiency, which I don't think, people sometimes say that he's not a good running back. I think it's more like this isn't a great running team. I don't think it's on Rachaad White, but he's not the guy who's going to like bust through to have his big game on a lower workload. So I think that like his ceiling for touches is a little bit lower, which is what's pulling some people off of him. And I think it's justified. I also think he would be in the second tier for me. So the second tier, you said, let's talk Lions running backs, right?
Yeah.
The second tier for me is Jahmyr Gibbs, Jaleel McLaughlin, Ramondre Stevenson. So I guess I cut down to only 3 guys in this second tier. But like Rachaad White could easily replace. There's a lot of guys who could replace the guys I have in this second tier, right? So what I like about Jahmyr Gibbs is, the Lions last year had, I think it was their second and third highest pass attempt totals of the season came against the Buccaneers. And we consistently see that. We consistently see teams having elevated pass play rates against the Bucs because of that run defense, because of that front with Vita Vea. And so that creates elevated opportunities for Jahmyr Gibbs to be on the field, elevated opportunities for targets. And David, like if you were to say who's the Lions goal line back, it's David Montgomery, but the Lions aren't one of these teams. It's like, okay, Jahmyr Gibbs is on the field inside the 5-yard line, take him out. It's more in the rhythm of the drive. And right. So Jahmyr Gibbs is going to get some touchdown opportunities throughout the year as well. And Montgomery will probably have more touchdowns than him, but Jahmyr Gibbs is going to have some touchdown opportunities, big play upside. He's going to have some targets. So I think he's a nice way to go. Higher price tag than I'd like, but that's kind of the state of the running back position.
I want to ask you about Ramondre Stevenson. I know you said he made your second tier here, had awesome usage in week 1. The one note that I've been kind of waffling with was Antonio Gibson entered that game pretty banged up. It seems like he's going to be more healthy this week. How are you kind of projecting Ramondre Stevenson's workload as it pertains to, Gibson's role?
Gerard Mayo has made it clear. He made it clear throughout training camp that they're going to ride Ramondre Stevenson. And then he came out of that game saying, you guys didn't believe me when I said we're going to ride Ramondre Stevenson. So I think that this is what they want to do. Also, how many opportunities is he going to have to really have 28 touches, and also what does that do to a guy's body by the end of the season if he's getting 28 touches per game? So I think it's one of these week 1 things where it's like, oh man, Ramondre had 28 touches. This is every week. I think we're going to see plenty of weeks where it's like 16, 17 touches for Ramondre as well. So I'm not overreacting to it. And touchdown upside in that game is not particularly high, but then it's also one of those things of like, how many guys have a locked in workload? I see Jerome Ford drawing a lot of ownership attention, but then it's also like, okay, they were trailing that whole game. What if they're a little bit more in control of this game? Does D'Onta Foreman come in and get a lot more touches than people were like? I don't think that backfield is fully fleshed out quite yet to where we can just say, oh, Jerome Ford is the guy for this team. And so, I think that Ramondre really has one of the few spots where it's like, okay, we know the role is very secure and he's going to get some receiving work. He's going to get a lot of carries and, no, the Patriots won't score a lot of touchdowns, but they can score a couple touchdowns and, Ramondre could be part of that. So, again, like he's a guy and he was up until last night. I was like, is Ramondre on my list? Is he not on my list? And finally I was like, well, who am I putting on over him? Right. So I felt comfortable putting him there. And it's kind of this thing, like I said, I really like Kyren Williams. We'll get to him more a little bit later, but really like Kyren Williams this week, feel very confident in him. Don't love Breece Hall's price tag or, Tennessee's been a really, really, really tough matchup for running backs for the last 3 or 4 years, but totally different, defense scheme there, totally different coaching staff there. The talent doesn't say we should be afraid. So Breece Hall feels pretty comfortable and confident. We know his role is secure. Jordan Mason's role will be secure if CMC's out. James Conner's role is secure. So they're like, that's kind of the 4, but outside of Kyren, there's nobody on that list. And I'm like, oh, I want to play them on 40% of rosters, right? So then it's like, I need more running backs than just that. And Gibbs, McLaughlin, Ramon, McLaughlin's just there because, he played 24 snaps, had 15 opportunities, 15 touches. He's 4,500, right? Like if I want to save some salary at the running back position, he's a very secure way to go. Do I think he's going to get 4x his salary? No. But do I think that I could build a more plus EV roster by saving that salary on a guy who has a real role? Yes. Right. So that's why he's on the list. And then it's like, there's other guys that you could say, oh, what about this guy? And it's like, sure. Like add him to the list, remove one of these. I don't love Jahmyr Gibbs at 6,600. Right. Add one of these other guys to the list, remove him from the list. So it's kind of like quarterback, running back. This is the nature of the slate. Like nothing really separates on this slate, so you ask about Patrick Mahomes, it's like, yeah, I could also, instead of making the case against him, I can make the case for him. And there's a lot of players like that this week that I think it's just kind of a little bit convoluted. It's like there's clear tiers, but nothing really separates within those tiers.
One, I generally try to kind of steer clear of some of the injury situations that are murky, but one that I just kind of feel like is going to pan out by Sunday is I don't think Kenneth Walker is going to play. I don't know if anyone's seen updated reports. It seems like that abdomen issue is giving him fits, hasn't been practicing. If that does happen, any interest with Zach Charbonnet at 5,800?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where DraftKings has gotten really aggressive about moving price tags on backup running backs when the lead guy's banged up. So at 5,800, I don't love it. Not a high scoring potential. And again, we talk about NFL game being about picking up first downs. And I kind of got onto this thought. And again, it's very obvious, but literally nobody talks about the NFL game in this way. And I got into this because I was kind of making some notes last weekend. I made this note that really the goal of a defense is to make it hard on the opponent to pick up first downs while preventing big plays, right? And that's the balance, right? You don't want to give up the big play, but you want to make it hard on the opponent to pick up first downs. And so how you win a game is how you go about doing that. And the Patriots have made it very clear that how they want to go about doing that is they want to stay ahead of the chains by running the ball when they have it. And they want to force the opponent to try to stay ahead of the chains through the air. They're going to take away the run game. And I don't know how much attention you paid to that Patriots defense week 1. Rookie Keon White, second rounder from Georgia, who's basically the equivalent of like one of those baseball players who's played every position except catcher. Keon White played every position on the front 7 last week in one game. So outside of the secondary, he played every position on the defense, right? And they're going to move him around and use him to clog up run lanes, use him to rush the passer. Like they just have a lot of chess piece type guys like that if they want to try to take away the run, they can potentially do that, right? So I don't think it's a great spot for Charbonnet because of how the Patriots want to approach games. They want to force the Seahawks to move the chains, move the ball through the air in this one. And so, I'm not against the play, but it doesn't really stand out to me. I'll tell you one that is kind of in this on the fence area is the Steelers backfield because Jalen Warren had 4 touches last week, and there was 4 total opportunities last week. And so then the question is, was his hamstring not fully right, Or does Arthur Smith just love Najee Harris, right? Is this what the offense is now? Because if Najee Harris is going to come out and get 20 plus opportunities again at his price tag, he's a really sharp way to go. And then in large field play, Jaylen Warren becomes really interesting because he's going to be current ownership projections like 0.5% because he had 4 touches last week. But it's like, what if that was just his hamstring not being ready? And he comes out and has his 12 to 16 touches this week. So honestly, by the time that I finalize the player grid, I'm kind of Friday, I'm in the midst of typing it all up and moving some pieces around. Now that we're talking about it, I could see Najee Harris kind of making his way on there as another running back in the second tier. J.K. Dobbins, you can make a case for him. He had, I think last week was the week to be on him, right? He was 4,600. Yeah. You could project that he's going to have a bigger role than people think. He still didn't have a huge role, right? He touched the ball 13 times. It was just really efficient. So, but yeah, there's other guys kind of in this range that I think could also be added to that list. And probably Najee is the one that, now that we're talking about it, I'm likeliest to add. But I do think Jaylen Warren's really interesting in large field play because you could have 3% of your rosters have Jaylen Warren. It doesn't sink your weekend if he has a bad game, but it could really put you ahead of the field if he has a real role this week.
Yeah, I like that call, especially because even if you assume Arthur Smith does prefer him to Jaylen Warren, it has to like skew closer to like a 60-40 and not what it was last week was like, what, 95%
Has to doesn't enter into the equation with Arthur Smith, but yeah, you would think one would definitely think.
All right, as we move to wide receiver here, I do just want to shout out some people hanging in the chat. We weren't live this week. We got Tyler, a member for 27 months, Sammy saying some nice things here. Shout out to Noel Fan, becoming a YouTube member, and then also for the very nice tip here via the super chat. I do want to mention, as always, for the memberships, you get 2 premium shows a week. If you become the Hand Builder YouTube member tier, you get the DFS After Dark shows on Saturday night. I bring on a guest around the space. This week, I have, his name is Gumby. He's developed some sims for the Battle Royale contest on Underdog. So if you're trying to get an edge in those, kind of figure out the next frontier of how the math shakes out for really optimizing your teams in that contest, check out that. And then we'll have the cram on Sunday mornings. That kicks off in the morning. We go through inactives, overnight news. We review the slate. We do ownership surveys, who everyone is playing. Very valuable show to get you ready there. So you can get access to all of that by becoming a YouTube member like Noel Fan here. Let's transition over to wide receiver. Jam, as always, so many different ways to go here. We have a couple kind of smash plays at the top. Cooper Kupp, CeeDee Lamb. You mentioned Deebo Samueel earlier, who is always a great play, especially if CMC is questionable. What are you seeing here at the wide receiver position?
Well, so you asked me for a recommendation for the thumbnail on the video on, was it Wednesday this week? Maybe it was Tuesday. I guess it was Wednesday. And it was like, I was still playing around with this slate. And like I said, so much of this overlaps, right? Where it's like, this is kind of a tier, but nothing really stands out. And so I said CeeDee Lamb. And then as I got deeper into the week, I was like, I don't know how much CeeDee Lamb I'm going to have. So I was gratifying to see that he's going to be one of the more popular wide receivers on the slate because it's like, okay, well, we can have a thumbnail of CeeDee Lamb and not necessarily spend a lot of time talking about him. But, CeeDee Lamb's one of these guys, you look at his game logs last year, he's so consistently high usage in this offense and he can win in any matchup. So, he's one of these guys, I think Dallas will control this game, but they controlled a lot of games last year where we still got good production from Dak and CeeDee Lamb. One of the things that kind of pulled me off of Dak is like, you know what, maybe he's not on my tighter build. Definitely going to have some Dak this week, but it was that his big games last year were generally, he had a huge game against Philadelphia. Remember how bad their secondary was last year. Had a huge game against Washington. Had one of the worst secondaries in football last year. A huge game against the Giants. Both those were blowout wins. And then one other game that was like, one other huge game for Dak was against like a so-so secondary, but in a really close, high-scoring game. And so it's kind of one of those where it's like, New Orleans has a good secondary. That doesn't scare me, but they have a good secondary, and they're probably not going to be able to get a ton going on offense against the Cowboys even. That's my take in this spot. And so it's kind of harder to see CeeDee Lamb putting this slate out of reach, but he's very clearly kind of in this top mix. Justin Jefferson, I'm not scared of the 49ers defense with a guy like Justin Jefferson. So I think Justin Jefferson's very much in this top mix. And then Cooper Kupp, obviously Matthew Stafford threw the ball 49 times, which probably isn't happening again this week, but Cooper Kupp 21 targets, and we can probably pencil him in for somewhere in that, 13, 14, maybe even 16, 17 target range. So Cooper Kupp. And then we mentioned Deebo Samuel, but he's another one up here who honestly, a lot of these high price guys, this is where I have a lot of confidence this week, is some of these higher priced wide receivers, which makes it tough because you can't really save money at running back. So you got to save money somewhere to fit in multiples of these guys. There's a lot of higher confidence guys up here at the top of the wide receiver range. So, Garrett Wilson being one of them, Deebo Samuel, if Christian McCaffrey is out. And then, a sneaky one, like I said, Marvin Harrison in this game that people want to play, but they don't want to play Marvin Harrison. Like, put yourself in the shoes of Drew Petzing. You're probably drawing up extra plays for Marvin Harrison this week. It's all about who's the first read on the play, and is that first read open? But if Marvin Harrison's open as the first read this week, he could easily see 10, 11, 12 targets this week. So yeah, I kind of like the higher ends of the price range. And those are the guys who stand out to me the most.
What about that Detroit Tampa game? So you of course have Amon-Ra, you got Godwin and Evans. We had the kind of week 1 Jameson Williams breakout last week. Is that a game environment you're interested in targeting?
That Jameson Williams injury was interesting because when he got tackled, like his legs are so long and thin and frail looking that when he got tackled, it was like, dude, how is this guy going to stay healthy all year? And then it was like, oh, he's hurt. And then he got tackled again later and it was like aggravated it. Jameson Williams is interesting because he's one of those players who we could look up in week 9 and he's actually priced at like 7,500. You know what I mean? And because his rookie year he was coming off the injury and then came in late in the season, people were excited about him and he wasn't really integrated into the offense. Then he had the gambling suspension to start the year last year and then never really got going until all the reports this offseason was like, this guy's, his study habits have improved and his play has improved and he's really understanding the offense. But it's like, we hear that all the time about first round picks that don't pan out. So Jameson Williams' range of outcomes still is as broad as this was his best game of the season. And 6 weeks from now, people are kind of treating him as a dart throw all the way up to like later in the year, he's 7,500 and we're clamoring to play him at that price tag. Right. So, Jameson Williams is one of those where the discomfort of the unknown makes me like not want to gravitate toward him on my rosters as much, which then makes me realize that he's that much more plus EV. So it won't surprise me if he just totally craters this week, but it also won't surprise me if he has another big game. Wide receivers don't go for 2,000 receiving yards, especially guys like Jameson Williams, who's just catching on right now. So he's not going to have 120 yards every week, but he could have several more big games like this. And then, Amon-Ra St. Brown putting together everything, right? The fact that the Bucs tend to drive opponents toward the air, the fact that he had, I think it was two of his top 3 or 2 of his top 4 highest target games of the year last year were his 2 games against Tampa. And then he's coming off of a 6 target game in the opener where you would think that the Lions would be like, hey, let's get him going in this spot. So he's one of these guys who at this top end of the price range, right? Justin Jefferson can go for 45 points. CeeDee Lamb went for 45 points like 4 times last season. Cooper Kupp can see like 16, 17 targets against this bad Arizona defense. So Amon-Ra St. Brown is in my tighter pool, but I kind of have him ranked a little bit below some of these other guys just because his chances of a true had to have it score are lower, but his chances of like a 25 plus point score are probably a little bit higher, if that makes sense. So I like him a lot. Talked about Jameson Williams, and then Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, I think they're very much in the mix. Mike Evans had, I think it was 2 games last year, north of 30 DraftKings points and never topped 32.3, right? So it's like, he's not going to bury you for not having played him. So he's in that range of he probably gets somewhere between 17 and 28 DraftKings points. And that would be, especially the higher end, that would be fantastic at his price tag. But also you can probably get away with not playing him and it won't kill you unless we have a week like last week where there's just nobody scoring points, right? But yeah, Evans, Godwin, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams are all on my wide receiver list this week.
So if you're following along, you might be like, all right, I'm getting up to these quarterbacks, I'm going to play, Breece, maybe Kyren. I'm going to play one of these stud wide receivers. I'm going to have to save some money here somewhere. Can you help us do that at the wide receiver position? I assume if that's kind of the direction of the build, you're going to have some like sub 4K guys to make this work.
Yeah. So sub 4K guys at wide receiver, there's also sub 4K guys at the tight end position. And I think it's a week when you really look at who's available among the sub 4K wide receivers, among the sub 4K tight ends. I don't know that there's a huge separation in scoring expectation between the two positions. So I think that this is also a week where you could viably justify going with two tight ends, because if you're going Jordan Akins and Mike Gesiicki, Jordan Akins, less likely to hit. We'll get to the tight end position in a moment, but like Mike Gesiicki is basically a wide receiver, just labeled as a tight end. But yeah, at the wide receiver position, AD Mitchell, again, came up empty last week, but 5 targets, wide open on 2 of them, which is just unusual at the NFL level. And if he'd hit on even just one of them, then the perception around that play is totally different. So he's a way to go where it's like the floor is low, but the ceiling's really high. Demarcus Robinson, Tyler Johnson, both going to be over-owned relative to their actual expectations. Again, Stafford threw the ball 49 times last week. If he threw it 35 times, they both would have been more in the 5 target range. But also, both of them are going to be involved. Probably both of them see anywhere from 4 to 7 targets. Allen Lazard, even though another guy was like, we had his big game, everybody was watching, the price hasn't been bumped up. But also, he had double-digit DraftKings points 2 years ago when he was with Aaron Rodgers, and he was like the number 1 receiver on that offense, but he had double-digit DraftKings points in 11 of 15 games, and he only averaged 6.7 targets per game. So even with Garrett Wilson dominating things here, if Mike Williams is not fully up to speed still, Allen Lazard can easily average 6.7. If we had a full season of Allen Lazard as the number 2, he could easily average 6.5 targets per game, right? And that's clear pathways to double-digit DraftKings points. So we've got AD Mitchell is more in the realm of like could get you 2 points, could get you 20. Allen Lazard is more in the range of like could get you 8 to 12, probably doesn't get you a ton more than that. So it depends on how you want to allocate that. And then all of these, we can even bleed into tight end because all of the cheaper guys on the Rams, Colby Parkinson, Ty Johnson, Demarcus Robinson, they all kind of fit into this of like you could add them to a Kyren roster or to a Kupp roster and just say one of these guys is going to get some targets, going to get some points. So I think if you're saving salary, that's really the way to go.
Yeah, let's head over to tight end here. We will be building a lineup after that. A reminder, 1 week season. The freebie week is done, but you guys can still get 20% off with promo code P. You're going to be able to get all of those goodies that populate over the course of the weekend. My favorite being the scroll. You get all kinds of thoughts, the end around Jam's player grid, Mike's player grid, the MME pool. Jam does some final thoughts right before the slate lock. So use promo code Pete. You get those 20% off and you'll be off to the races for this season. It is interesting, like you said, saving money at tight end is going to be a necessity, if you are trying to get in some of those higher end running back wide receivers. We also are coming off a week where all of the elite tight ends and basically the entire tight end position on the whole flop. And so it does seem like some of these guys on the high end are going to be overlooked. And yet the prices didn't really come down in a way that forces you to be like, man, I'll play Sam Laporta at 5,400. It's like, no, he still costs 6,300.
Right. Yeah. And to be fair, Laporta's on my list, Trey McBride's on my list. And those are game environment bets, right? Where you're saying there's going to be a lot of points, probably going to be a lot of points scored in this game. And we don't know exactly who's going to get those touchdowns. So let me get exposure to these guys. Kittle, large field play. I want some exposure there. Kelsey, again, in my stacks around that game, I'll have some exposure there. But outside of Laporta and Trey McBride, I am going down to those lower end of the price range. Taysom Hill being one of these guys who, again, people don't want to play him, but he's going to score double-digit DraftKings points probably about 65 to 70% of the time. And every once in a while, it's going to be about 20 points. He had it was like a 30-yard pass where it was like one-on-one coverage,
it was a
right?
fade into the end zone.
And he catches that. That's an extra 10 points. And people are looking at like, oh, there's Taysom Hill putting up almost 15 DraftKings points again. So he's very much in the mix for me. Colby Parkinson, Jordan Akins, Mike Gesiicki, probably in the reverse of the order I just said them in terms of my level of comfort in playing them. Maybe Colby Parkinson over Jordan Akins. You could flip-flop those. But Mike Gesiicki, I think, is the best option there. And obviously Gesiicki, we've got the year in Miami where he didn't really fit in with that offense. Unfortunately, he was franchise tagged. So they're paying him as like an elite tight end and not using him. And then the Patriots last year where they couldn't figure out how to use and that team was kind of broken. But even with that, Mike Gesiicki has done nothing the last 2 years, right? He has 99 career games. He has scored double-digit DraftKings points in 19 of those 99 games, and he has scored 18 or more DraftKings points in 9 of those 99 games, right? 18 or more DraftKings points is rare from a guy who's priced at 3,100, and he's done that 9% of the time in his career. So with T. Higgins out, and they're obviously going to have to be passing the ball in this game against Kansas City, I think he's a really interesting option with more ceiling than probably a lot of people remember that he has. So Akins, who's probably going to get 4 or 5 targets, Colby Parkinson, who probably gets 4 or 5 targets, kind of in that Higbee type role, and Mike Gesiicki, who probably gets 4 or 5, but has an outside shot at seeing more work than that. I think all these guys are in the mix.
Yeah, and on the Gesiicki note, he had a touchdown called back last week too. That would have probably boosted how people were thinking about him heading into this.
Yeah, and it took a while for the touchdown to get called back, and all the drafting standings changed, and it just stayed that way for a while, and then it was oh, sorry, you don't get that touchdown.
Let me ask you about, I know you didn't have a ton of interest in Lamar, but still would love your thoughts on the Ravens kind of tight end split. Everyone kind of wondering, is likely the guy now? Is Andrews undervalued? They're both still kind of pricey, 5K and 4,800. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm interested to see how ownership shakes out as the weekend progresses, because as of yesterday, which is very early ownership runs, and that's primarily algorithm driven based off of projections, but Mark Andrews was projecting for really high ownership and Isaiah Likely really low ownership. I would imagine that as we get to the more human side of things, then it'll override what projections are showing, and that'll bring that gap back down, which would actually give me more interest in Mark Andrews if that ends up happening, because I do think that he still has. The thing with Mark Andrews is last year, I think it was 3 games all season, over 6 targets, right? He's not a heavy usage guy in this offense. It's just that he can have these multi-touchdown games. He had a 22-point DraftKings game last year, 25-point DraftKings game last year. They were both multi-touchdown games. So it's really about, does he get multiple touchdowns? But once or twice a season, that's probably going to happen. So I think Mark Andrews is a perfectly sharp way to go this week. And honestly, I think Isaiah Likely is a perfectly sharp way to go, especially if he stays kind of in that sub 5 to 6% ownership range, because sometimes these roles shift and we're late to adjust to them. We just think, I don't want to be the fish who's going to Isaiah Likely because he had a big game on national TV. And then it's he's actually going to continue getting 7, 8 targets a game. So I think both those guys are very much in the mix.
Yeah, and it does seem like you said the answer from a season-long perspective could just be both. It's going to be hard for each of them to hit a ceiling in a given DFS week, which is why you're going to need to choose on a given week. But then, like you said, you just can let ownership kind of drive that decision for you, at least until we get more data on how this tight end room is going to split. All right, I think it's time to build us a lineup on DraftKings with some of JM's favorite building blocks. All right, JM, we got the screen here. As always, I will mention the Deposit Kingdom Weekly League. We had a shift this week. I made it a 3 max. Our friends at DraftKings were able to accommodate us. It did mean it filled a lot faster than usual. Normally, there's some spots open by the time we go live here, but everyone maxed that out. So there's a few things here. We'll make it bigger next week, and you guys need to be in the Discord to get pinged when it goes live. I normally will post it on Tuesday in there. So if you guys want first crack at it, it's a $10 3 max rake free league. And then I'll review the winning lineups on my Monday portfolio review show every Monday on this channel at 10 a.m. Eastern. I also just want to mention for the people who did get into this one, DraftKings had some weird issues with the prizes. Jam, this is a 500 person contest that says, here is paying out to 595th place, even though there are only 500 people. So
what are you doing, man? Let me get in there.
Yeah, this is what's actually going to happen with it. We are redistributing that extra money, that 475, which was 500th to 95th. We're going to give an extra 250 to first, an extra 150 to second, an extra 75 to third. My rep over at DraftKings is going to take care of that with the account. So that is the payouts there. Had to get that clear. But JM, let's get right to the building blocks. We were kind of dancing around some of the guys we knew might be here, but lay out the case for how we're starting this.
I mean, I feel like if anybody read my content last year, they had to have seen this coming, if they cared enough to guess. And that is Kyren Williams plus Cooper Kupp. And there's a lot of numbers that we could go through, but I'll go through just the simplest ones. And that's that we had 10 games last year where we could take this, basically where we could say among the top two guys on the Rams with Kyren, Kupp, and Puka, with all of them playing, two of them playing, whatever, 10 games. And in 9 of them, they combined for 42 plus DraftKings points, the top 2 players from this group, right? So when you only have 2 of them playing, we had it with Kyren and Puka at the start of the season when Kupp was out. When you just have 2 of them playing, like the chances of getting 40 plus points are so high. So they cost 14.4K in salary. So 42 plus points, that's about 3x their salary. Now that's not what we want. But when you think about that being the floor on 14.5K in salary spent, so the way I like to think about it like this is think about it like one player. It's actually more valuable to cover 2 roster spots with a chunk of pretty much guaranteed points. But think of it like one player. So think about like a Justin Jefferson. So think about Justin Jefferson being priced at 9K and hitting 27 points 90% of the time, right? That's basically what this block equated to last season. So 9 out of 10 games, they scored 42 plus points. 8 out of 10 games, they scored 47 plus points. And 4 out of 10 games, they scored 55 plus points. So then that's like basically Justin Jefferson going for being priced at 9K, going for 36 or more points 40% of the time. So this is like, it's like a more expensive Tyreek Hill or Justin Jefferson in terms of the range of expected scoring that you're going to get from combining Kyren Williams and Cooper Kupp. So the way that I'll play this week is probably about 40% of my rosters will have these 2 guys together. And then probably another 20% will have just Kyren without Kupp, because there's a lot of times they could combine for 50 points and it's like one guy gets 27, one guy gets 23. You might as well have them both. But there's going to be those times where one of them gets 40. There was a game last year where Kyren Williams had 41 points and Puka had like 6.8 or something like that, as the second best scorer from this group, right? So in those situations, you don't want to have the you don't want to have just, you want to have that one guy isolated on his own roster. So probably 20% of my roster with just Kyren, probably 20% with just Kupp, and then probably 20% with neither guy. And on those rosters, because I still expect the Rams to do well in this spot, on those rosters that have neither guy, I will have one of Colby Parkinson or Jamarcus Robinson or Tyler Johnson on those rosters. So 100% of my rosters will have a Rams piece. 80% will have at least one of Kyren or Kupp, is how I currently expect myself to enter this week. But it's just a great block because you get a lot of salary spent. You know that a lot of work is flowing through these 2 guys. You have a great matchup against an Arizona defense. It's high effort and good scheme, but also like from a talent perspective, they're ranked 32nd by PFF on the defensive line, in the linebacking unit, and in the secondary. And so a really, really nice setup to get early in the season where you could lock this in. And this is what makes me like this week, because everything else on this week is kind of like, man, I don't know what really separates at this position, this position, this position. But the fact that I can lock in this sort of floor of points across a huge chunk of my rosters gives me a lot of positive expected value. So there could be those, the 10% of the time where this ends up missing, and then a huge chunk of my rosters are sunk. Maybe all my rosters are sunk. But if we could play at the slate 100 times, just playing these 2 guys together on a huge chunk of rosters would be massively plus EV. So I love weeks like this and just put you immediately ahead of the field.
Yeah, and this is, they're mispriced, obviously, for their roles, specifically Kupp without Puka in the lineup. They are going to be very popular. I am curious how popular they will be together. I think,
yep. And that's also part of the value here is like a lot of people will have these guys individually, but if they hit together, that was what I talked about last week with Tyreek Hill and Devon Achane. A lot of people are going to have Tyreek Hill. A lot of people are going to have Devon Achane, but play them together. And most people who you're now moving ahead of the Tyreek Hill rosters if they both hit, because they're not getting that Achane score. And you're moving ahead of the Achane rosters if that block hits, because you're not getting that Tyreek Hill score. So it's a similar thing here. Most people won't play these 2 guys together. And so playing them together kind of moves you ahead of both sides of people who benefit from this.
All right. So we got our core block in here, the Rams Alpha duo. Where are we going next?
I kind of feel like we should go cheap next. And maybe go, one of the cheap guys we didn't touch on at wide receiver is Rashid Shaheed. So he's somebody we could consider here, not super cheap, but cheap enough that kind of frees up some salary. Derek Carr threw the ball only 23 times last week. Rashid Shaheed, of course, had his 5 targets and hit for a big play, I'm always willing to play him. And maybe we have to move lower. Maybe we have to move even cheaper than him to make this roster work, but let's start there. And then one of these cheap tight ends, since we're going Kyren and Kupp together, we're not going to go Colby Parkinson on this one. So let's go ahead and go Mike Gesiicki on this one. Gets us a little bit of exposure to that Bengals and Chiefs game and gives us a little bit more flexibility with our salary. And in fact, we can even go defense last just to say, like, what type of salary do we have to work with? So defense, kind of this 33 to 3,400 range is where I'm most focused, because you've got the Colts taking on Malik Willis. You have the Chargers taking on Bryce Young. So we can go with either of those that you want to go with. We even have the Steelers taking on Bo Nix at 3,500.
Yeah, let's go ahead and let's put the Colts in for now. And like you said, we can adjust. So we have the Kyren Kupp block. We got Shaheed, Gesiicki, Colts D. That leaves us with a quarterback, a running back, a wide receiver, and a flex, but still an average of 6,150 remaining. So in good shape here still to get some nice pieces. You got a quarterback stack for us?
Yeah, one of the things I was just thinking, although I don't actually necessarily want to allocate salary this way, I was thinking we could go Daniel Jones, Malik Neighbors, but then we would want to bring it back with Terry McLaurin, or Jaden Daniels, Malik Neighbors, Terry McLaurin. I really like Malik Neighbors this week. He's one of these guys who last week, everywhere you looked, you could see sharp people saying this is probably the cheapest we'll be able to get Malik Neighbors for the next 10 years. And then, he gets 7 targets, which is actually still pretty solid. Goes 5 for 66 on 7 looks, which is really solid. Now playing this Washington secondary, and I just think this is a great spot to get somebody who should be priced higher than this. So let's throw Neighbors in, and let's kind of play around with this. We can throw Neighbors in, and let's go ahead and we've got the block of points we feel confident in with Kyren and Kupp. So let's go ahead and throw Daniel Jones in and make it look a little bit ugly, but just know that we're going to save some salary. We're going to have a lot more flexibility from here. And what this is going to allow us to do is we could either go with one of these Washington running backs who I don't like on tighter builds, but I do like in large field play this week. So I could have a little bit on tighter builds because I don't necessarily want to go McLaurin and then have a ton of salary left over for our last running back spot. It's a poor usage of salary. But or we could even go say, let's not have a bring back here. Let's go all the way down to like Jaleel McLaughlin and just see how much salary we can have to play around with at this last wide receiver spot, because there's a chance that we could get, we might even have too much salary doing this. We can go as high as our cover boy, CeeDee Lamb, on this roster. It doesn't really fit with like any sort of thesis that we're building here, but he is opposite Rashid Shaheed. If Shaheed's hitting, then that, in fact, that's kind of my favorite way to play Lamb this week. I talked about that. And one of my write-ups was, you probably need the Saints hitting some big plays, and Shaheed's the best way for that to happen. And actually, it's kind of fell into our lap, but that is a pretty good looking way to put it all together, because you've got a story in which Shaheed and Rashid is hitting enough big plays to force CeeDee Lamb to have to continue to produce throughout the game. You got Kupp and Kyren together. You get the salary saver with Jaleel McLaughlin, and then you got Daniel Jones, Malik Neighbors. No real story told there, but we also saw last week that maybe Washington keeps the game close and nobody actually ends up producing the type of score that you needed to have outside the quarterback position.
I'm just laughing, JM, because I was reading the chat, and the Kupp Kyren, and everyone goes, "Oh, it's going to be so popular. I've seen other people talk about this. This is so chalky." Then we put in Daniel Jones, Malik Neighbors, and people, this is getting too cute. This is too far off the board. So I love that within a span of just 2 minutes, JM, you went from building the chalkiest lineup to the most contrarian, too cute lineup. So you gotta just wait a few minutes.
And what's one of the things too to think about is, it's good to have chalky pieces, because a lot of times they're chalk for a reason. Sometimes they're not really chalk for a reason, but like most weeks, some of the chalk pieces are going to be pieces that you literally had to have in order to compete that week. So then how do you play them? You play them by doing something different, whether that's pairing them together or putting in something like Daniel Jones and Malik Neighbors, where actually Daniel Jones is not going to be that unpopular this week, but probably in that like 4 to 6% range. And, obviously the matchup doesn't get much better. It's crazy. It's really crazy. Our perception of Daniel Jones versus the reality of what he's actually produced in the Brian Daboll offense. Like, he pretty consistently, especially 2 years ago. Last year, he had like on and off the field with injury, but 2 years ago with Darius Slayton as his number one wideout, he was consistently, like, his bad games were 14 to 15 DraftKings points, and then he still had his typical, can't predict it. Here's a 28-pointer from him. Can't predict it. Here's a 30-pointer from him. So it's not as ugly of a play as it looks like coming off of week one. And he certainly has that within his range of outcomes. And we kind of have a history here. When people start talking about a play like that negatively, probably means they're
Yeah.
going to hit for like a 25 to 30 point game. So there goes your vomit stack first place finish type setup.
That does feel like how it goes, right? Where everyone is willing to discount the floor for Daniel Jones, which even people who like Daniel Jones will be the first to admit he can bottom out. We see that happen a lot, but you also can't discount his ceiling. We've seen this guy go for 30 plus points multiple times, and now he has the best wide receiver he's ever played with. So I'm with you on that one. I thought maybe just a real quick fun thing to look at would be like a 2v2 if you didn't want to go high on Lamb, like maybe the Connor play you talked about, and then what that leaves you with, like 7K. In that range, I feel like that could be another avenue. What would that leave us with there? Like Marvin
right
Harrison or Deebo.
Deebo's right there at 6,800. And then you could also flip that another way and say, okay, so here we have a roster with Deebo, and then another roster we bet on Jordan Mason, which saves us another 1,200, and it gets us up to Justin Jefferson. I think we would have just enough salary for Justin Jefferson in that scenario. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of play those final two spots. So we're 100 off for Justin Jefferson, but it's easy to kind of massage things, go down to Jordan Akins, make that salary available for the Justin Jefferson play. So I think the starting point really gives us a lot to play around with. And Rashid Shaheed's another guy that you can move off of, right? Because he can go for 22, 25, 28, which that's what we love about him. But he can also have a 9-point game, and you're paying 4,600 for that, as opposed to, paying 3,600 or 3,200 for a similar type of score. So the main thing though is just thinking about, like, once you start with that block of points from Kyren and Kupp, there's so much that you can do. And this is one of those spots where I remember a week where Antonio Brown was 50% owned and went for 52 or 55 DraftKings points, right? Like, sometimes you have to have the popular guy. Or Devontae Adams a week where he was like 40% owned and went for 45 points or something like that. Sometimes you have to have the popular guy, and that's just the way that it is. Kyren and Kupp are going to be this popular for a reason, and I prefer them over the cheaper guys, because they're going to get the bulk of the work in that game, in that matchup, and then you kind of build around from there.
I haven't had a chance to do my the DraftKings building block lineup build disclaimer that I feel like I gave a lot of times. JM probably mentioned, 30, 35 players on his short list over the course of the show. DraftKings gives us 9 spots for a lineup. Not every single player we discussed or is going to end up in the lineup. The whole point of this is to get you thinking about the blocks, the pieces, and then you can go shuffle them around. If Jordan Mason's a lock button for you, go put it in with him and see what you can get up with. But what this is supposed to illustrate is how we are trying to get points from certain blocks, and a Daniel Jones stack block, a Cooper Kyren block, and then you can fiddle with that from there. So again, a lot changes between now and lock as well. This is about teaching you to fish, as you'll see over JM's shoulder here. Don't do us.
I'll note that
go for it.
Players are so much less important than how you put together a roster and how you think about strategy. And so that's really the purpose of this portion of the show is less about play these guys. It's not even at all about play these guys. It's more about how do we think through a roster and talk through the strategy on a roster and position ourselves for first place finish. You can put any guys that you like in. It's just about how you're thinking through those targeting the first place finish, which is the most obvious thing you could do in DFS, and yet the thing that most people don't do, or even if they're trying to do it, don't know how to do it. And that's what we really focus on, is how do we think about getting to first place and build accordingly from a strategy standpoint, from a floor ceiling standpoint, everything in between. So you can hate the players. That doesn't matter. Ideally, you're learning more about DFS, which is not about the players. It's about the game of DFS.
Jam, anything else I forgot to mention as far as what is up on 1 week season? I know a lot of people have obviously are familiar with what you guys offer, but maybe if we got some new people here, what should they keep an eye out for if they are, dipping their toes into the OWS waters for the first time?
Yeah, I think at this point, your audience is always growing. I think a large chunk of your audience has experienced OWS, they found if it's a fit for them or not a fit for them. But for anybody new, again, we focus heavily on the strategy component because that's really what it takes to win. And the edge is not typically, and we do, I think, have an edge in the player specific component because of the unique things that we're paying attention to, but really that's just to get you in the door. And then it's about learning DFS. And so what I always say is we don't build it for everybody. So if you come to OWS and you don't like it, then that's a square peg round hole type of scenario. This is not the site for you. But if you come to the site and right away you're like, oh, I actually kind of like this resonates with me, then that's because we built it for you and you'll probably really like it. So you can use that discount code Pete on a week pass and test out the site and see if it's a fit for you. Or if you've kind of dipped your toes in last week and you're like, oh, this is different from what other sites provide, and this resonates with me, then you're one of those people we're building for, and you can come on in. And we're really flexible with refunds. So if you come in on a full season pass and 2 weeks along, you're like, you know what, this isn't a fit for me, just let us know and we'll send you that money back. So pretty much zero risk.
There you go. Check it out, guys. Up next for me in 10 minutes, I will be doing Off and On the Clock with the Badge Bros. I believe it's just Nez today, but if you guys, I saw some questions in the chat about underdog draft strategy. That's what we're going to do for the next 90 minutes on Off and On the Clock. We'll be back next week, same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, live for the week 3 slate. Good luck to everyone. Check out those final building blocks and final notes on 1 week season as the course of the weekend progresses. And JM and I will see you guys at the top of the leaderboards. Peace out.